My name is Sandeep Agrawal, as was said before, and it's my privilege to be the moderator for this session. As you know, this session is on revenue sources, municipalities, and land use planning, so more about the economics of how things are done. This is very topical and timely. As you know, we are in the midst of reviewing the Municipal Government Act here in Alberta. So I'm going to just read what this session is about. This will be to discuss the linkages between current and revenue sources and land use planning and related environmental outcomes. And we will discuss ways in which municipalities can expand their revenue sources. And of course, to guide us and explain to us further, we have three very distinguished panelists here. I must admit, and as was said before, I personally am not an expert in municipal finance, but I know about the planning side. So I will just stick to the moderating side of things. So I'm going to introduce our three panelists here. Now I'm a bit nervous to introduce a mayor in public, and I have never done that before. So before coming here, I had to look it up and how to address. So here's how it goes. So His Worship Crouse, Mayor of St. Albert. He's a native Albertan who spent over 30 years in the forest products industry. Mayor Crouse was re-elected to his third term in 2013. So as you can see, he's very popular in St. Albert. He currently chairs the Capital Region Board, and this is his second term as a chair of the Capital Region Board. And as I understand, he spends a lot of time coaching hockey. I don't know if that's true or not. Councillor Rice was first elected to Grand Prairie City Council in 1979. She is a newly elected president of Alberta Urban Municipalities Association. As an elected official, Councillor Rice has led a number of community initiatives. She supports a number of governing boards and organizations. She is dedicated to her community and has been recognized for that through numerous awards. The third panelist we have is Professor Emeritus McMillan. Professor McMillan is an economist and has spent about 35 years or so in the Department of Economics at the University of Alberta. As I understand, Professor McMillan retired in 2010 or is in the process of retiring, as one can do as an academic. His research interests are in public economics and the demand for and the supply of public goods and services. He has advised a number of governments in Canada and abroad, and has worked with a number of organizations nationally and internationally, like the World Bank and CEDA here in Canada. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to just give you a brief idea of how we will proceed here. Now, this is a little bit different from what I was told before. So here's what I'm asking our panelists to do. Each panelist will make an opening statement for no more than 5 minutes, so 5 minutes. And I will first ask His Worship Crouse, followed by Councillor Rice, and then Professor McMillan. And following the opening statements, I will pose a question or two just to get us going. I will get you some time to think about your questions as well. And of course, then we'll entertain questions from you. And at that time, what I would ask you to do is raise your hand and perhaps go to the microphones that are out there and introduce yourself and then pose your question to a speaker on the panel or to the panel as a whole. So with that, we'll begin with Mayor Crouse.
Thank you, folks. I'm not going to use slides. I'm just going to speak. I was at church the other day. There was an elderly lady in the pew next to me saying a prayer. She says, "Dear Lord," she prays. It's been it's been a tough last 2 to 3 years. Just last year, you took my favorite country singer, George Jones. You took my favorite actor, Patrick Swayze, my favorite musician, Michael Jackson. Dear Lord, in the past 3 years, you've taken my favorite actress, Elizabeth Taylor. And last year, you took my favorite all-time singer, Whitney Houston. Dear Lord, it's been a tough 2 to 3 years. I just wanted you to know my favorite politician is Rob Ford. Why, over the decades, have hamlets disappeared and villages stayed small and some towns grown to become cities? And I believe the answer in all of that is really about regional leadership. Why have some regions prospered and some regions stagnated? And I believe it's really about regional leadership. I'm going to talk a little bit about the Capital Region Board per se, and then I'm going to talk about some urban matters and just how we link land planning and revenues together. First of all, very briefly, for those of you who may not be aware, the Capital Region Board is a board of 24 municipalities. It's towns and villages. It's everyone from Bruderheim to Lamont to Wabamun, Sturgeon County, Parkland County. So 24 municipalities, including Edmonton, cities, towns, villages, counties, etc., and including the specialized municipality of Strathcona. Various priorities include energy, land use, housing, public transit, geographic information systems, perhaps economic development into the months ahead, and we've recently agreed to have a staff member apply to become involved in the water development efforts. We're mandated to create 50-year solutions for the region, all kinds of growth and needs and demands, and in part because we're growing at the rate of 25,000 per year of population in the region, but there are many other reasons for that. Not the least of which is in the world there are 600 regions that have a conurbation or a major urban center of 1 million people, and we would fit into that category, having Edmonton plus the 5 or 6 surrounding cities. So the need for us to be planning is evident. We spend time on some urban growth matters, such as the demand for densification, and I'll talk about that in a moment. We talk about the collisions of the urban and rural growth, which is evident wherever you go in those 600 regions around the world. We spend some time talking about the outer ring road, the need for public transit growth, and we talk about the park and rides. And I believe an opportunity, for example, where urbans and rurals can work together in all of this would be park and rides. One of the speakers earlier on this morning talked about the importance of park and rides, or the importance of transit development, and how that reinforces the need for, or actually reinforces the densification patterns. We look as a board around the connecting of car transportation and public transit together, and park and rides would be a good example of that. And regional housing. Our future priorities is the renewal of the 50-year plan. It includes the important agricultural land policies, watershed matters, transit, roads, and economic development, and more. Now, I'd like to just link that, since I've only got 5 minutes, but I'd just like to share that we would believe, I personally believe, that the next, at least the next 5 years in this province are going to be more and more defined by collaboration. There are such plans necessary where we have municipalities working together. I believe the update of the Municipal Government Act is likely not going to be too provocative. I think it's going to continually reinforce the importance of working together. I don't see the province taking a provocative approach to the Municipal Government Act update. So I believe that one of the key principles in the next number of years is going to be collaboration. Another example where that gets pointed to is the work that Dr. Mike Percy's done, who was, I think he might still be, or was the U of A Dean of Business and Economics, when he wrote, and he's advocated for there to be IDPs throughout the entire province between adjacent municipalities. And so there are so many things that could be worked on, but I think what's going to be reinforced wherever we turn is the importance about local decisions, local autonomy, but innovative solutions for municipalities working together. Examples in the recent 4 or 5 years would be Edmonton, St. Albert working jointly on LRT planning, Fort Saskatchewan, Sherwood Park working together on housing. The industrial heartland would be a good example of many municipalities coming together. Fort Saskatchewan, Strathcona working on an intermunicipal cooperation agreement. Leduc County and Edmonton on implementing Leduc Transit. Intermunicipal agreements recently between Leduc and Leduc County, and recently work between Devon and Leduc County on joint plans. Certainly an expectation has delivered from the province on working together, and we would at the Capital Region Board deliver that on an ongoing basis. The most recent example was great collaboration really led by Mayor Iveson and Mayor Flynn from Sturgeon County and the City of Edmonton working together with St. Albert on the MDP for Sturgeon County. A good example of how you can come together to make things happen if you work hard at working together. And what does this all mean to planning? We all need to capitalize on this movement of working together. I think it's really about broader thinking versus local thinking. As we've merged into becoming more reliant upon each other as municipalities as the decades have gone by. I believe we're going to find ourselves in more and more cross-boundary planning, whether it be for cost, revenues, or economic development, and in some cases to maintain our identity, but still delivering services to humans, not necessarily delivering services to cities or towns or villages. I think we will nurture the thinking of carrots. I think what we need to do is have those carrots for joint collaboration in order for all us to work. It will be the leaders who ensure the planning that would occur that is regional and sub-regional and innovative that will make this happen, and I think incented by the province through collaboration. So this is where I'll close when I speak about the province and the urban's role in all of this. Urbans must have the guts to battle NIMBY. And now this is where I wear my urban hat and I take off my Capital Region Board hat for a moment. The guts to battle NIMBY. Infill, well, Mayor Iveson spoke about infill this morning. Infill is the toughest issue to deal with as a mayor or as a council member. Densification is extremely difficult it's not as difficult for Edmonton because they've dealt with densification especially in the downtown area. Very difficult for the Fort Saskatchewans, very difficult for the St. Alberts and the Sherwood Parks to be able to deal with densification. It's very difficult for the urbans to deal with growing up instead of growing out. Very difficult. St. Albert, as an example, approved a as high as 19 stories for 5 buildings about 5 or 7 years ago. And it hasn't been built yet. Very, very difficult decisions to make. Urbans must do such things as green roof policies, and those are also not easy because they're expensive. I suppose you should. Urbans must deal with the urban farm matter as well, sooner or later. Urbans are dealing with it as we speak. But urbans must have the guts to battle those things. The politicians must. And the province must step up, in my opinion, with incentives on collaboration. And this is where the province has an opportunity. For example, let me just use a tire tax as an example, where a tire tax could be put toward transit, where a vehicle registration tax could be put toward the infrastructure. The province must step up on the agricultural land policy, and we heard some good examples this morning. And the province must continue to move forward on the long-awaited watershed work that they're doing. But at the end of the day, planning has to be collaborative. There have to be some incentives in order to move forward. I think the province has a key role in that, and we all have to have the guts to provide the leadership. And with that, Sandeep, thank you for having me, and I look forward to the questions in a few minutes.
Thank you, Mayor Crouse, for those remarks. Councillor Rice.
Hey, thank you very much. It's indeed an honor to be on the platform with these gentlemen. Mayor Crouse, early in his career, spent many years in Grand Prairie, and Nolan and I organized every Canada Day function in Grand Prairie for many, many years. And I look at Nolan now as the mayor of a successful, vibrant city of St. Albert, and I think, back in those days, I always knew one of us would be successful, but somehow I thought it would be me. And of course, my opening remarks will be very brief because Mel has made his opening remarks longer than his 5 minutes, so he's negotiated converting some of mine. So I will immediately get started. Alberta continues to be an economic engine for Canada. The real GDP expanded by an estimated 3.8%, propelled by a jump in consumer spending and residential investment, along with continued gains in business investment. Alberta led all the provinces with a 2.7 job growth and had the nation's lowest unemployment rate. Alberta's energy-driven population growth is 4 times the national average, and we are expected to grow by another 1 million people in the next decade. That's like adding a city the size of Calgary. Municipalities have to provide the core infrastructure needs: roads, bridges, water, wastewater facilities, waste management, emergency responses that are necessary to sustain Alberta's rapidly growing economy. In fact, Alberta municipalities provide almost 60% of the public sector infrastructure in Alberta, yet collect only approximately 10% of the taxes. Municipalities are responsible for providing core critical infrastructure that enables Alberta's business activities, as well as provide quality of life services to attract and retain the necessary workforce to support our economy. Examples of this critical infrastructure include transportation and transit systems. I mentioned water and wastewater system, fire and police facilities, culture and recreation centers. Alberta municipalities have had to address significant infrastructure pressures resulting from our energy-driven growth. And we have the aging infrastructure, water, wastewater facilities. We have insufficient transportation systems to connect Alberta's natural resource products to market, and we have a lack of community infrastructure to keep pace with our population growth. So I will look forward to the upcoming Q&A where we can talk about the challenges that municipalities face. And I'm going to apologize for remaining seated during my presentation. At my age, you just relish any opportunity to remain seated that you get. So I hope you could hear me okay, and thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Councillor Rice. Professor McMillan, and
Can you get by there, Mel, without, okay.
And as I understand, you're using a PowerPoint?
Yes.
Okay.
I have some PowerPoints, but I'm afraid you're going to be disappointed in them. They're pretty vanilla type. They don't have great swaths of green and blue and nice colors and pictures and so on, so apologize for that. Great to see so many people that are interested in municipal government and municipal finances and its impact upon, or talk about the impact on land use planning. My specialty is more the finance, and it certainly isn't the land use planning. But as indicated, with the rapid growth, we're interested in the situation where you're looking at land use, utilization of open space, and preservation of agriculture. But we have to keep that in the context. And the context is that when we're thinking about this in our, for example, in municipal finances, we're thinking about, but also in broader context, we're thinking about this in terms of how can we make improvements in markets and in government that are going to result in an overall level of social well-being. And so what we're really thinking about is trying to get the right signals, the right incentives, in economist terms, the right prices, to help decision makers manage these kinds of resources in a better way. Now, the session here is focused on public finances or municipal finances. That is only a small part of the whole picture, and as we've already seen, I mean, we've had the mention of infrastructure. Infrastructure is, spending, so we'll have to look at public spending. We have to think about the regulation, the land use planning that goes on, and that is particularly important, as we saw in the last session, and an important consideration to take into account. And we have to remember that land use planning and regulations are not free. They actually have costs associated with them, some of them mentioned in the last session. And finally, we have to think about it in the regional context, as Nolan mentioned. This is not a municipal government problem. It is, it's partly a municipal government problem. But the bigger problem is it's a regional problem. We have to think about it in a regional context. Okay, I guess I can. So, I'm going to talk about municipal finances and possible effects that it might have on land use. And if you're going to do that, we should talk about or have some familiarity with what are municipal finances, what do they look like. And I'm using, excuse me for my colleagues on the panel, but I'm going to use the city of Edmonton as an example. So these are the revenue sources for the city of Edmonton. There are a number of things to note here. About almost 80% of the revenues that the city of Edmonton collects come from own sources, that is, charges and taxes that they levy themselves, and about 20% come from grants primarily from the provincial government and largely for infrastructure. Another feature of this is that property taxes, which we all think about when we're thinking about municipal finances, property taxes are a relatively small part. In Edmonton, they amount to 35%, just over a third of municipal revenues. And when you look at that more closely, and one of the things that may have an impact upon development is that half of those property taxes come from residential property taxes, and half of them come from business and commercial activities, okay? So there's a big split there, but only half is coming from what you and I think of as the property taxes that pay. So less than 20% of municipal revenues in Edmonton are coming from property taxes that residents pay. What did I say? Less than 20%, I hope I said that, okay. Another important feature is that a number of the revenue sources are user fees. So the sale of goods and services, for example, is large, fines, penalties, licenses and permits. But the one that really is important for land use is the developer contributions and donations. And although they're not a very large part, they are large when it comes to financing the cost of new development and spreading that cost or getting that cost back from the new developments and the impact that it may have on new developments. And let's see, that's probably enough for now, okay, on this. Then what about the expenditure side? So we can go here and look at expenditures, and here I'm simply going to focus on two aspects of this. One is the transportation portion. We see that about 21% of city expenditures are directed towards transportation, and half of that, about 11%, is roadway related. Now on the capital acquisition side, about a third of that is roadway related. So I'm really going to focus on these roadway aspects, and as in that, about 23% of the costs of the city of Edmonton are roadway related. That is vehicle related, such as our passenger cars, for example, in commercial traffic. Okay. Despite the fact that 23, almost a quarter of the costs of the city are roadway related, there are no taxes or fees or charges that the city has that are directly related to transportation, that are related to vehicles, or vehicle, and particularly to vehicle use. So, if we did have a tax that was related to vehicle use, and particularly vehicle use, what might, would it modify, would it send out a signal that would modify land use? And this, help to develop a more compact city, help to preserve open spaces, agricultural land, and so on. And many people have argued for vehicle user charges as a means of doing that. And I am just speculating a little bit on an example here. And I'm going to assume that we might get 50% of the cost of roadways from some kind of a vehicle user charge. Okay? And I'm using that user charge to cover that 50% would be almost $600 per capita, or sorry, per vehicle in the city. And we don't need that. That $595 per vehicle would generate revenues within the city of $279 million. And what would that do? Well, using that $279 million, which would be collected from passenger vehicles only. You'd want to tax all vehicles, but I'm looking at just that portion coming from passenger vehicles, which are about 80% of the total. And you could use that to reduce property taxes, residential property taxes, by about 58%. That is a reduction from $593 per person in property taxes to $250 per person in property taxes. So what I'm suggesting here is that the existing mechanisms that we have for financing municipalities have relatively small impacts on land use. And if we tweak those, we're not going to get great changes. But if you think about changing, if you want to have a change or a revenue source that might impact land use, I don't know how much this would, but it's going to be related to travel and to vehicle use and transportation. And this is a suggestion where you could have a revenue neutral change that would have an impact that might be significant. Okay, thank you very much. Look forward to your comments.
Thank you very much, Professor McMillan. I'm looking at my notes and just recapping what was said before. We talked about growth, we talked about collaboration, moving away from NIMBYism. Professor McMillan talked about various sources of revenue, and they vary all the way from property taxes, business taxes, different kind of levies, development charges, grants, and so on and so forth. But those are the only sources that are available to the municipalities across Canada and specifically here in Alberta. Just a quick stats that I want to give out just to trigger our thinking a little bit further, just reacting to Professor McMillan's charts. In Alberta, 43% of revenues come from property taxes. So across Alberta, 43% of revenues come from property taxes, as opposed to 35% here in the city of Edmonton. 26% from sales and user charges, and 20% from provincial grants. So if you think about development charges specifically, it's about 6% here at the city of Edmonton, but across Alberta, across municipalities in Alberta, it's very, very low. It's about 1%. So just to kickstart the questions, what I would ask to our panelists is to tell us what can we do. Professor McMillan talked about vehicle user charges, but I want to go beyond that a little bit, and if three of you take some time and talk a little bit about how else we can improve municipal revenue structures, how else we can add potential new sources of revenues to municipalities. So maybe with Mayor Crouse.
Yeah, I'm not sure that there's any, honestly, I don't think there's any magic bullets out there. I think that the one that the speaker this morning that talked about the sales tax in Colorado, I found that rather interesting, because I think what I heard him say was that there was a sales tax, and it was part of that sales tax was disproportionately distributed to urbans versus rurals because of the urban, and it really was to incent urban public transit use. But frankly, I do not see there being any magic bullets out there. I do believe, and it's interesting that Mel and I hadn't compared notes at all before we both spoke, but we both talked about vehicle tax. I believe either a tire tax or a vehicle tax or some sort of a tax that is then moved into some sort of and I would suggest it be public transit, but I think representing, if you were to look at it urban and rural, it might move into a broader matter of transportation. But if I remember correctly, there are about 3.5 to 4 million vehicles registered per year in Alberta. Let's just say it's 4 million. Well, you can do the arithmetic. If a vehicle tax or a tire tax was put on, that would be an example of a sales tax that would be targeting at a particular group. So that's where I would go, as opposed to a broad sales tax. I would target it at particular matters that you wanted to incent particular categories of change in society.
Well, AUMA has been advocating changing the revenue options for municipalities so that there isn't such a reliance on property taxation. The other area that has been raised by our members is a more reasonable municipal structure that allows for better decisions and revenue options on a regional basis. The options should provide an incentive for managing a region from best land use perspective with a balance of competitiveness to attracting businesses to the region. No more standalones. We've got to start thinking regionally. Most municipalities also believe that off-site levies should be increased, and the scope of what they cover should be expanded to include the range of infrastructure needed to create communities such as recreational facilities. For many years, AUMA has been requesting legislative changes to expand the use of off-site levies in support of a broader scope of infrastructure costs and capital assets, but until recently, our recommendations have received significant pushback from the development community. Imagine that. So those are a couple of ways I think we need to go in the future. We have to go in the future. If you look, and I use Grand Prairie because I'm obviously more familiar with it, Grand Prairie has become, the city of Grand Prairie has become the hole in the donut. And the minute we opened it up and the rural municipalities started building urban densities on our borders, that's where the big problems began escalating.
Okay, is this on? Yep. This is a big question in terms of how to improve municipal government revenues, and if you're really talking about substantially changing the tax structure or reducing the property tax, there's really only two things to look at. One of those is a sales tax, which you often find in the United States, not many other places, at the local level. And the other is a local income tax, which you also find in the United States, plus it's also found in many other countries, particularly in Europe. Those generate revenues. The major revenue sources are income tax, sales taxes, property taxes, okay? And sales taxes has some significant disadvantages to them, although they will raise revenue, and there's been some discussion of sales taxes in the penny tax proposal that came out of the Canada West Foundation a few years ago. If you want to see some discussion of this, Professor Dalby, my colleague in Calgary, and myself have written a paper, two papers actually, on this. And that will be coming out of the School of Public Policy at Calgary sometime in the future, near future, I hope. But the other thing to remember is that in Alberta, property taxes in Alberta today are the lowest that they have been in 60 years, okay? By lowest, I mean the burden of the property tax relative to personal income is the lowest today that it has been in 60 years. And the reason for that is primarily, it's not that municipal taxes are lower, they've stayed pretty constant, but the reason for that is that the provincial government has reduced or allowed to decrease the school property taxes. The property taxes, the provincial property tax for schools. Since 1996, that has gone down continuously, and that has brought the property tax burden down dramatically in Alberta. So there's part of the question is, do you really need any other source of revenue when property taxes managed to serve us so well 30 years ago, 40 years ago, 50 years ago? Fuel taxes, that's another possible means of, often mentioned for collecting revenue at the local level, a local fuel tax. Local fuel taxes don't quite cut it. They won't generate a lot of revenue. If you wanted to get 1% of the total revenue of the city of Edmonton, you would need a fuel tax of 4 cents a liter. Now, I think most people would probably think that 4 cents a liter was a fairly high tax. And also, these kinds of taxes don't work very well unless they're done on a very regional basis, and regional cooperation is a bit of a problem. So, anyway.
Okay, good. Thank you. So I do see a question there. So, sir, if you could introduce yourself quickly and then pose your question. Yeah.
Sure, thanks, and good morning. Name's Scott Milligan. I work in land use planning for the province. Question, I guess, is for the elected officials, Mayor Crouse and AUMA President Rice. So I was thinking this morning about Class 2 soils or high agricultural soils, food security. Some of my observations in sort of planning across the province is there's some areas where we have water shortages. This issue of country residential. So I'm quite curious about, and I was thinking about the NIMBY comments he made there, Mayor Crouse, and sort of this might be NIMBY in a different way. You know, we've got these country residential areas, I would say, expanding into ag land perhaps more so than dense developments, using a fair bit of water and infrastructure. So just curious how you've grappled with that at the municipal table, at the sort of at that leadership table.
Well, at the Capital Region Board, if I could use that one, what we have done is identified the density requirements, if I can use that word, for country cluster residential. What we have never tackled, and I don't know that we will, is the future of country clusters because they exist today. Now, whether or not I think there's going to be some resistance in the years ahead to add much more country cluster residential too close to urbans. simply because of the difficulties. I think it's Sook, BC, if I remember correctly, maybe not, but in BC, I think they ended up having so many cisterns and so many septic tanks that they ended up having, such a challenge as they tried to progress. So I don't think that I don't think that our policy today is all that bad. However, 100 years from now, somebody may look back and say it was terrible. What we've tried to do is in the Capital Region Growth Plan is focus the growth of those clusters in a particular area instead of just anywhere and everywhere. So that's kind of a long answer to say I don't think we certainly haven't tackled it and said they're no longer required. But what we have done is tried to make sure they're focused in particular locations.
I think part of the problem that we have, and there's a saying that says, if you don't like the reality that exists today, build a new reality, one that makes sense. We have difficulty in that. You get the rurals and the urbans. The urbans just say, give us all that money. Give us some of that linear assessment. You have a lot. We don't have more. Bottom line is that's not going to solve our problem. And the other thing, and I'll use the word regionalization, and I really hate it because the minute you say regionalization, everybody, okay, I'm not talking to you anymore. So come up with a new word, a new definition, a new something that would work. But I'll use regionalization because we haven't come up with the new word yet. But regionalization could have benefits to land use planning. So instead of competing for development, and revenue comes with it, then the municipality would consider the most appropriate location for development based on other things such as preserving the ecosystem, efficient use of existing infrastructure, access to transit. So we think that there is a solution out there that's called community or neighborhood zones. That's just the only word we've come up with so far. And this would ensure equitable population distribution, but it would allow neighborhoods to deal with specific issues. We think somewhere, somehow out there between what is happening now that doesn't work and some solutions that have been put forward that aren't going to work either, there is a compromise position. There has to be, and that's why we're really pleased to have the university getting involved in these type of, now you've got a neutral, knowledgeable body that can put forth proposed solutions.
Professor?
Yeah, I can toss in a comment here. I think country residential is an important issue because it is one of those things that can probably result in some considerable consumption of agricultural land. But I think more important, and this relates to Helen's comments, are that the reliance that I pointed out in Edmonton, and this exists in other municipalities, the importance of industrial, commercial, non-residential taxation to municipal revenues really means that there's a lot of competition for those revenues, and or for those kinds of industries, and whether they locate on this side of the border or that side of the border is really critical to the finances of the municipalities, whether this one or that one. And some kind of a sharing arrangement that respects the costs that are involved with these municipalities or with these developments to the respective municipalities needs to be worked out. And I would certainly say some kind of sharing would be a logical thing to follow up on.
Thank you. Yes, question.
Hi, my name is Todd Zimmerling. I'm with the Alberta Conservation Association. I'm not a planner, nor am I a politician, so I guess I'm having trouble linking this idea of having more revenue in a municipality to some type of change in land use or land use planning. Yep. In most cases, logically, to me, if you have less revenue and you're having trouble paying for what you start thinking a lot more about, do we really want to build more roads further out and have all the infrastructure that goes with it, and maybe we better rethink how we're planning versus if the money's flowing in, we don't have to worry about it. Sure, we can build that new road and the new structures and everything else because we have lots of money. So I was hoping maybe the panel could link the increase in revenue to changes in land use planning.
Yeah, I think I can take a shot at that. I'll give you see if I give an example to point that out. So let me use park and ride as an example. So recently, Strathcona County. Let me use what I'm most familiar with. So St. Albert and Edmonton are working together on a park and ride right at the boundary of St. Albert and Edmonton. That's going to be a $30 to $40 million park and ride. So what? Well, if you can build that park and ride, you're going to need that $30 to $40 million. But around that park and ride into the decades ahead will be densification, because people are going to want to live next to a park and ride. So what have we done? What we've done is we've preserved agricultural land, and so here's an example where the County of Sturgeon, as an example, is going to benefit by a park and ride in Edmonton or St. Albert. Less agricultural land is consumed. The people who are going to commute can go to that park and ride, and if there's 20-story buildings around it, more people can live close, and that is the end of the road right now as we know it for LRT. So you've linked saving of land to densification and the preservation of agricultural land, but you need $40 million or $30 million to do it. We don't have the money, and we don't have the guts necessarily to build it, and we don't have the ability to work regionally right now to be able to get Sturgeon County, Edmonton, the province, and St. Albert to build that. That's just a good example, I think, that's alive and well. And there's one in Parkland County, there'll be one in Sturgeon County, there'll be one in St. Albert, there'll be one in Fort Saskatchewan, there'll be one in various municipalities around. So those are examples of how you link them together. You need money to save the land, and you need money to grow up, but you need to have you working together to make it happen. Just a live example.
And I think that's pretty much the point I was hoping to make, is that just the urban municipalities beating on the rurals and saying, give us money because you have a lot and we don't, isn't solving anything, and it isn't getting any place. Looking at things from a regional perspective so that you're making development decisions based on the best place for it, things that the ecosystem, agricultural land, you would start to make intelligent decisions instead of competitive decisions. And I believe the Alberta government at some point has to step off the edge of that cliff, and maybe they would do it with a little more confidence if they had advice from the U of A. They're not listening to us.
Thank you. Yes, ma'am. Question.
So my question is for the professor. My name is Evelyn Nickel, and I worked on financial incentives for conservation in the province. Recently, in relation to the federal government's movement on the federal eco-gifts program, there was a ton of background analysis done in terms of using existing tax mechanisms to provide those incentives. And one of my concerns at looking at new sales tax mechanisms is in relation to the costs of administration of a whole new tax system. And I was just wondering if there had been any local or recent work done on how to keep those cost systems down for administrating a whole new tax system. Thank you.
Yeah, if you're going to talk about a sales tax, I mean, we have a national sales tax, a GST, value-added tax, or that's what it is, type of tax it is. And so there is a national system. All the other provinces either have a provincial sales tax, a retail sales tax, or they've harmonized with the federal government's GST. And so there are difficulties if you think about piggybacking, as we call it in economics. That is, if a local government were to try to add a local tax on top of a GST or an HST or even a retail sales tax of a province, although there's less when it comes to the retail sales tax. There are some difficulties, but I don't think that they're necessarily impossible to deal with. Opinions differ on that. But if you have to administer a new tax system yourself, the administration costs are high, which means that in order to make it reasonable, you have to have a fairly high tax rate. And so in situations for a local government, really on a sales tax, you have to talk, for administrative reasons, you really have to talk about piggybacking on top of an existing tax by a provincial or a federal government.
Can I?
Go ahead.
Just that I'm not maybe going a little off topic, but I just want to make it clear. I see like our friends from the Alberta Association of Municipal Districts and Counties are here, and so I don't get beaten up at lunch. I like to, don't think for a minute from any of my comments that we envision the rural municipalities as running every morning into their vaults like Scrooge McDuck to count their money. One of the acknowledgements is that rural municipalities, one of their problems is they have huge transportation costs, absolutely huge transportation costs, and agricultural land doesn't provide a huge tax return to those counties, and they use the linear taxes to offset some of those huge transportation costs. So they have their problems too, and that's why we have to come together in mutual understanding. But I didn't want to make it sound, like I said, that they were just taking all the money and saving it for themselves. So
I'd like to use one other example, I think, to Todd's question about linking land use to money. And here's an example. I'll give you a St. Albert example. So inside St. Albert, we've got a one particular, well, of course, was farmland, and it has been zoned residential, and in fact, zoned multifamily residential. But the developer summer follows it every year, all the time, and gets taxed on a farm at a farm rate inside the city of St. Albert, dead inside the city of St. Albert, does not grow any crop on it. It's only summer followed, so there's no tax revenue for the city. It's not farmland, and the developer gets taxed at the lowest possible tax rate in Alberta. And so, but the city of St. Albert has no choice. So there's a great example of wonderful, wonderful farmland yielding nothing to society. And we have a couple of those developments right in the city, or non-developments in St. Albert as an example. And I'll bet you it goes all the way across Canada. If they were farmed, it'd be different, but these aren't farmed. They're summer followed.
Okay, we're getting close to 12, but we can take one if it's a quick question. Please.
Yeah, I'll
go
make
ahead.
it quick.
Yeah.
Thank you, Helen, for clarifying there. We don't want to fight with each other. We're all under rapid growth right now. We're trying to keep up as the rules, and that, industry's coming in and flying all their workers in and out because we don't have the infrastructure or that to keep the people in our communities. We don't have the community halls, the sports plexes, and stuff like that. So it makes it really hard for everybody under this rapid growth, no matter if it's urban or rural. We need to be able to work on this together to try to solve these issues, and we need to be able to do something with the people that are flying from Fort Mac to Kelowna. Those people are going out to Kelowna. They're living in a $450,000 house in Kelowna. Where's our tax dollars out of that? A lot of these people are flying to Saskatchewan or Manitoba when they're finished their shifts. If we had those revenues in Calgary or Edmonton, and that, or else in Fort McMurray or in Peace River or Grand Prairie, that's where we need to do them kind of things and not be importing or exporting all our good jobs, that pay that we're making out of those good jobs.
The people living in Phoenix probably feel the same thing about Albertans coming there for 6 months, however, so it's a little bit of a tit for tat, isn't it?
Well, no, because they're going down there to Phoenix and generating revenue for Phoenix. Our snowbirds, right? They're going down there and paying for everything that they use down there. Here, the people that are flying in from Kelowna to Edmonton, the industry's picking up the tab for them to fly from Kelowna to Fort Mac and then flying it back home. We should be taxing that part of it because that job was here in Alberta, but we're not getting nothing out of it. There are no houses being built, no taxes being paid on that property, but it's a good job, $250,000 a year job. They can afford to do those kind of things.
Of course, you have to remember, too, that the city of Kelowna has some municipal costs dealing with those people and their families.
So
Same as Phoenix.
and I think the problem is, we're standing between you and lunch right now, so I'll be very quick. As I said, the system we have now is not working, and there are several anomalies, several areas like that. Right now, our whole system, our current system, drives everything toward property. I believe, and I'm not a visionary, I'm a practical person, but I believe out there is a system. It's a system with the urbans, the rurals, because you know what, Albertans don't care. They don't drive along and go, oh, I've just entered the county of Grand Prairie. They don't care. They're going from point A to point B. So urbans, rurals, the province of Alberta, academic institutions, this kind of collaboration, I believe Alberta could produce a model that would be a model for not just Canada, but all of North America. I think we have the ability to do it, and we have the need to do it because of our major growth. Sorry.
Okay, I think it's just over 12 o'clock, and I don't want to keep us away from the lunch. So we'll wrap it up at this point, and please join me in thanking the panel.